And he's not the only one saying that.
He's not, and clearly Julia Gillard did have sort of some delivery problems during the whole disaster period over Christmas. But I really think that in a big way, this is the normal process of a Prime Minister getting used to authority and an electorate getting used to a Prime Minister. And I think we forget that John Howard, back in the beginning, there were acres of columns written about how he had this sort of nervous shoulder tic when he was doing press conference, about his eyebrows, about all sorts of things. I think what compounds it with Julia Gillard and what she's really suffering from is that the Labor Party as a whole has lost authority, has lost trust, that people don't entirely trust it. That's what Tony Abbott's been capitalising on so well, and I think that's all being sort of projected onto this normal process of a Prime Minister kind of growing into the job and being entirely focused on, you know, should she wear a pantsuit to the floods or shouldn't she wear a pantsuit to the floods, or did she sound genuine while trying to talk to grieving flood victims surrounded by television cameras. I mean, really, it's much bigger than that and much more complicated problem for Labor than that.
It is about her authority, I guess, and Nikki, I think she's aware of this because she talks in the first person a lot these days, that a lot of things that I intend to do.
A lot. I saw her interviewed on television a few days before her press club speech, and the interviewer said to her, "How do you feel about all the criticism about you?" And she said, "Well, George, it's not really about me. You know, it's about them." And then 3 days later, it was all about her. It was I, me, me, me. So she is trying to establish, you know, her authority in the job. And after 6 months, she hasn't been able to do it. She hasn't been able to bring her own persona to it. Every Prime Minister has a different character. We haven't been able yet, I don't think, to work out what hers is. What is she going to bring to the job? How is she going to handle it? Is she going to be a reformer? Is she going to be an administrator?
Yeah, we'll go to that in a second, because she delivered a speech this week aimed at answering precisely those questions. But, Dennis, to take Lenore's point that it's harder for her because the government itself is flaky. It's there on a knife edge.
Yeah, I think Lenore's point is a very good one. It's about style in a context, and the context is a government that hasn't got the authority we normally see in a federal government. They can't make decisions just like that. They have to negotiate with various people to get things done. There is still some hesitancy about Julia Gillard's leadership, and the reasons for that are probably quite complex. And to this, Julia Gillard brings a formality which reflects in part her sort of background as a lawyer. Now, in the context, it looks stilted and a bit wooden. In another context of a government that's sure-footed and in command, it would probably look terrific. So I think if the context changes, I think our perceptions will change.
And the only way that that the Labor Party could overcome this is by delivering. So it puts the weights on them to deliver a carbon price, to do the participation things she talked about in the CEDA speech, to really make good on every promise. Because if another failure, another stumble, another policy stuff up, and, you know, they'll be in big strife.
Which means long term they might be making different judgments about this government, but of course you've got to go long term, and that's the question. Can the government survive long enough to put all of this into place?
Well, isn't Tony Abbott's strategy would seem to be that since he's failed to kind of bully the independents into swapping sides, he's going for the court of public opinion, and now it's going to be this wrestle in the court of public opinion over can the government keep the trust of the voters or get the trust of the voters back, or does Tony Abbott's narrative about the government prevail? And I think that's what's going to be really interesting, because his strategy is clearly to try to sway the independents because the government is so unpopular, to continue the slide in the government's popularity. And so I think it's going to really be played out in the opinion polls. Well,
you mentioned that what she needs to do, Nikki, so let's have a look at part of that speech. And it was kind of missed largely because, naturally, it was lost by major events around the country. But let's have a listen to part of what she had to say in that CEDA speech.
But friends, the biggest challenge arising from the boom is the shortage of skills. There are many thousands of individuals on the disability support pension who may have some capacity for work. That's why this year I will continue to take steps to improve the incentives for such potential workers to get into the labour market. With courage and imagination, we can build a high-skill, high-tech, low-pollution economy that will succeed independent of our mineral wealth. This is my vision for the nation.
Now, if that was intended as a catch-all, was it adequate?
Yeah, it was a pretty good speech. I think her two big speeches this year so far, the National Press Club speech, which was about responding to the South East Queensland floods, and then the CEDA speech this week, have both been quite good speeches. They're well constructed and quite well delivered.
But look at what she's put out there, by encouraging a whole lot of people who are not working now to get back into the workforce, and the small matter of putting a price on carbon.
A huge agenda, massive agenda on top of everything else that's going on at the moment. I thought one of the clever lines in the speech was equating the carbon tax to the floating of the dollar with Hawke and Keating. But of course, Hawke and Keating were super salesmen. And even they had trouble, especially with their own caucus, getting those things through. So I sort of look at Gillard and Swan now, and I think Hawke, Keating, Gillard, Swan.
And they didn't have to deal with the Greens.
And they didn't have the Greens. So, to do this on top of everything else, mining tax, tax summit, welfare reform, water reform, asylum seekers, massive agenda.
Of course, welfare participation is something the opposition says it's also concerned about, so it's an issue where...
Well, that was language that had been used by the previous government.
Exactly, so it could in fact be somewhere where, God help us, we might see bipartisanship on an issue of reform.